Brilliant. So, as I said, welcome to the Man Met Game Centre. We host monthly and sometimes more than monthly events across the spectrum of game studies. This month's event is all about live action role-playing games and research on Larp, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if you are just engaging with us for the first time and you don't know much about us, the Man Met Game Centre is based at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. We have quite a broad research focus across game studies from digital to the analogue, and you can check out our website mmgamecentre.org to find out more about our research interests, our current projects, and our staff members and our PhD students. And there's always something going on our events page as well, so do check that out. We have all of our previous events, or most of them, are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if there's anything caught your eye from previous stuff that we've done, then you can watch those recordings at your leisure on our YouTube channel. So do check that out if you've got the time. So brilliant. I'm really pleased to welcome two brilliant researchers to Man Met Game Centre today to talk about Larp. And what the aim of the event is to think about new research on live action role-playing games, and in particular to explore Evan and Michael's work in that area, but also to think more broadly about the value of playing, writing and studying live action role-playing games as distinct from other modes of games, because LARP is quite a distinct game activity, leisure activity, culture, and distinct, I think, from other modes of role-playing games and other modes of analog play, partly because it sits slightly outside, almost entirely outside the kind of commercial relations that often pertain in games, particularly in role-playing games, which, as we know, is kind of, we've got Wizards of the Coast, D&D, we've got a kind of a big commercial element kind of shaping that culture. Live action role-playing tends to take place outside those relations, and I find it really interesting for that reason. But you might not know much about LARP, so I'm going to just give us a little intro about LARP and what it is from my point of view as a researcher on LARP, and feel free to throw your own definitions into the chat as well, because I know my definition is just one that I've come up with, and it's not necessarily one that pertains to all LARP activities. But so LARP, or live action role-playing games, are, I would say, physically enacted role-playing games that require players to enter a specific location, a real place. Sometimes during the pandemic, that real place has been maybe Discord or Zoom, and that space is demarcated as an in-game space where we, the players, play our characters for the duration of the game. Now, LARPs may last anything from a few hours, say at a convention, to a few days, a big fest LARP, during which time player characters are responding to dramatic events in real time. They're solving puzzles, they're playing through crises, and they're doing this largely through a fairly immersive, embodied performance that's not being punctuated, as it is across the tabletop, by kind of narrative moments or kind of out-of-game moments. So it's really interesting from that point of view. There are different types, of different modes, genres and cultures across LARP, and often these slice across national borders. And you might know, for example, there's some quite sharp distinctions between, say, UK LARP and American LARP, and Nordic LARP all have a kind of distinct cultural sort of modality that tend to operate in those countries, although there's increasingly, I think, blurring and crossover and cross-cultural and transcultural borrowings, which is quite nice to see. And LARP has distinct appeals to different audiences, and often people are involved for purely entertainment, particularly those of us that are really interested in fantasy or horror genre LARP. Elsewhere in LARP culture, it's really used quite specifically to explore social issues, particularly issues of social marginalization. And it's used obviously in education and training, and it can be used, I think, to good effect to foster civic participation. A colleague and I are going to try and run a LARP for the Political Studies Association for young people getting involved in climate action to simulate kind of climate disaster and use LARP to kind of think about participation in that. So very much kind of at the educational end of LARP. LARP research is a relatively small field, I would say, although growing, I think, and it cuts across disciplines. We're going to see two very different perspectives today from different disciplines, but generally, people working on LARP, they might be coming from performance studies, role-playing game studies, media, literary studies. Certainly my approach to LARP is very informed by literary studies. I know Evan likewise too has a literary background, but also psychology and education and kind of much more applied sciences. So the two speakers today are going to give short papers that gives a little insight into their current research on LARP. And as I've said, they're going to be coming from different disciplinary perspectives and approaches. So it's going to be interesting to look at that. Now, there will be chance to ask them questions about their specific research, but I'm also interested in posing some questions to the panel about LARP more broadly and sort of its social and cultural value and why we research it and what, as researchers, how we're positioned often as LARP writers and as players, as well as researchers, and that kind of interesting crossover that's happening in LARP. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Evan Tarner. He's Associate Professor of German Studies and Film and Media Studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he's also the director of the University of Cincinnati Game Lab. Now, he's been writing LARP and working on scholarship about LARP for over a decade. He's co-founder, of course, of the journal Analog Game Studies and the Golden Cobra LARP Challenge. So his latest game, Diamond 20, with Kyle Latino, was in the Festival competition, which just happened recently, just a couple of months ago. So you should check out Evan's published work too. He's co-edited several books, including the volume Immersive Gameplay, Essays on Role-Playing and Participatory Media. And as I've said, he's one of the driving forces behind the Analog Game Studies Journal, which is a fantastic resource for those of you who might be looking to find out more about LARP research. So Evan's paper today is on affordances and constraints in LARP adaptation. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Evan. I'm going to turn my mic and camera off and let him talk to you about his work. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming. This is a small group, and that's a good thing. It means that we can have a rich discussion afterwards, and I'm trying not to take up too much space with my own words. And in part, you know, these concepts I'm dealing with are drawn very much from my own play and design community, that it's not, you know, me as this genius who came up with any of this, but rather it's a dialogue, and I'm presenting to some degree what's happening in the LARP design community, our sort of terminology and processes and headaches, translating them to an academic audience for your benefit. So who am I? I kind of am wearing multiple different hats. One is that I'm a Germanist. I study German literature and film primarily, and teach at the University of Cincinnati courses like Survey of German Culture. I also do our Intro to Game Studies course there, and since 2016, I've been director of something called the UC Game Lab, which basically allows me to run events, invite some speakers, as well as collect games and promote a local playtesting and game creation culture. Basically, if you want to have a game design community, you need to have a place that's safe where you can discuss things that are weird and that then you have freedom to fail. And if you don't have those things, then it's very difficult for you to build a local game ecosystem. And that's what we do in Cincinnati. I'm the coordinating editor at the International Journal of Role Playing, but then I also co-founded and I'm still an editor at the Analog Game Studies Journal. And I co-founded the Golden Cobra Challenge in 2014 as a means of generating, again, a body of material that would address specific design challenges in LARP. So I'm very much presenting sort of a core understanding that we in my own sort of LARP design community share. And the Golden Cobra is a good place to find it. You can also find all of the Golden Cobra games since 2014 on that site, available for download. That is goldencobra.org. So tonight I'm not going to talk about what LARP is and why you should care. Okay, maybe I'll go into it a little bit, but that is to say, a lot of people's initial impressions of what LARP is comes from an impressive sort of mock medieval array. although I'm also aware of lots of other LARP media now circulating outwards, from College of Wizardry to Fortune and Felicity, and then here's Legion, right? All of these are kind of high budget costume LARPs that rely on multi-day and intense player engagement, which is not always something you can rely upon. So, okay, LARP, again, I said I wasn't going to talk about what LARP is, but you can kind of think of it in three different ways. One is just, you are taking a fictional world and imposing it on the real world. Eric Fatland and Tobias Wingard says it's a meeting between people who, through their characters, relate to each other in a fictional world. That's, again, LARP is relationships. Samara Steele notably called it a kind of program that runs on people rather than computers. And Lizzie Stark, again, who's much more invested in the playable theater dimension of LARP, it calls it the theatrical pieces, but without audiences and scripts, make believe for adults. So again, if you're thinking, is LARP a program for people to follow, or rules in the game, or a theater piece? Well, yes, that's the answer. It's all those things, and that's one of the aspects that makes it so interesting to research. I'm also not going to go into the broad history of LARP and adult pretend play beyond a fairly superficial coverage right now, which is, again, it goes back thousands of years. We have documentation from Egypt and Babylon on early LARP activity that Martin Eriksson famously wrote about in a essay called Play to Love in 2004. Lizzie Stark wrote about Queen Elizabeth I's avid LARPing and sort of the creation of these dress-up parties with, again, elaborate rules and codes of behavior and situations that then adult role players would enter into. This is a quote from Lizzie's book, Leaving Mundania, which I always recommend. She writes, amid a busy schedule of hunting, bear baiting, and joust watching and acrobatic shows and plays, Elizabeth repeatedly encountered figures from myth who popped out of the shrubbery to poetically praise her and ask her for assistance. For example, while returning from hunting one day, the queen passed over a pool close to the castle. A guy dressed as the sea god Triton swam up to her to beseech her majesty on behalf of the Arthurian lady of the lake, who was being threatened by the evil Sir Bruce. After the queen cowed the enemy with the majesty of her aura, the lady of the lake glided across the water on a movable island to thank the queen. Later, the mythical musician Arion appeared out of a 20-foot-long mechanical dolphin with a 6-piece band hidden inside. And the boat was made up so its oars then appeared to be fins. I mean, this is very elaborate sort of theatrical staging work with also what we consider to be LARP elements, such as the sort of submissions and quests and a kind of theatricality that has a direct play and interaction element in it. Games were also intrinsically linked to early English theater, as with Gina Bloom's research, and on and on and on. The 1920s, when the term role-playing was invented by Jacob Moreno, then led into a kind of a tradition of psychodrama and improv theater. We can document strategic simulations at Rand Corporation that were ceased because they were becoming too fun. We can draw a trail of thought to Guy Debord and European situationism, as well as the SCA, the Society of Creative Anachronism, and wargaming culture in the 60s and 70s. So that then by the late 70s, many different places around the world simultaneously created something called LARP, whatever they called it. It was live in Sweden, or the kind of a Tolkien role play in the in Soviet Russia at the time, right? So there's lots of different LARPy activities, and they of course spill into various other kids simulation activities, mock trial, model UN, and the reacting games in the US context, where history students play out the historical scenarios, right? But I'm not going to go into that too much in depth. Instead, I'm just going to talk about yet another theory about how to design LARPs. And why am I doing this? Well, in part, it's me getting a system I used for teaching for about 5 or 6 years out into the world so that people can use it and make use of it. But and it's also very much in response to about a decade's worth of thinking on LARP design. It goes back further than that, but this is really the key. I could write a whole dissertation on this slide from Erik Fatland from Solmukota 2012. The snapshot was taken by Epi Ravachol, and right there at the top, rule 1, LARP design equals predicting player behavior. That blew my mind in 2012. I hope it blows your mind now. The idea being, of course, that you are, of course, as a game designer, trying to figure out what the players will do in the situation. How will they behave if you introduce element X, and what then can you do to incentivize them to achieve your goal, which may or may not be related to element X. This means that you are taking, again, as the point 2 says, players who are insecure and striving to conform and actually do want to realize your vision, but it's very difficult to see that sometimes. And so there's also this word that keeps coming up, affordances, and we'll get back to that later on. Players read the affordances of other characters, and that is to say they are trying to latch on. If you are a warrior standing there with a sword, someone may want to fight you because you are a fighty character, unless that this has been explicitly stated that that's not the case. And players are actually trying to maintain coherence, which means you can often introduce very incoherent elements into a LARP, and players will do their best to make them fit into their world or story world. They will try to create real relationships with other people, and that then it says players react to the affordances and constraints of social structures in the fiction. And so the main thing about this slide is that it's using this language of affordances and constraints, which I'll get into in just a second. And that, I think, catalyzed a lot of our own thinking at the time in Western Massachusetts when I was living there. And also that it's coming from a design thinking point of view, right? The same design thinking that produces commercial projects, bridges, and so forth. And so the mixing desk didn't make it, but the mixing desk of LARP, which is also in collaboration with Erik Fatland, appears a year later. Jason Morningstar and Jay Lee come up with this pattern language for LARP design in 2016 that I still use quite frequently for my own work, again, to try and respond to the various pressures that a situation will add to my LARP creation. And then this is what we consider to be the Bible right now of LARP design, which is the LARP design book that came out for the Knutepunkt 2019 Knutepunkt convention, which is a Nordic / European LARP meetup that happens every year. This one will happen in September in Sweden, and tickets are already gone, so that's not trying 2023. But this book contains everything that you need to kind of conceive of, plan for, and execute a LARP, which again is everything from a wedding, with a space, to a game, to a psychological session, to a unfolding story that then you have to moderate. You have to kind of adopt all of those roles. And when Disney was planning for the Galactic Star Cruiser, they actually stared at LARP and said, the people who are organizing this, who are all volunteers usually, are doing about 7 different union recognized jobs in one job without compensation. So if you wonder why LARP organizers are burnt out now, it's because we finally realize what our value is and why we can't have nice things. But it also means that in designing a LARP, you do have to follow Johanna Koljonen's advice and consider every aspect of the LARP a designable surface. That means space, time, player attention, player culture, where are they coming from? What do they know about this activity you're about ready to do? And you really are designing for that situation and not, some abstract system or game that someone's going to play like chess. This is my community, right? JiffyCon, Western Massachusetts is just the surface organization, but we ran independent tabletop games and LARPs in Western Massachusetts from about 2006 to, maybe about 2014, 2015 when it petered off. But it was primarily started by Emily Care-Boss, and then we had folks such as Epi Ravachol and Vincent Baker and other fairly prominent figures in the role-playing game scene, indie role-playing game scene, who were involved. And we would have this thing, the main point of this slide is the coffee. We would have coffee and game design meetups where we would specifically talk about affordances, constraints, and what we call the core loop of a game. What is the game doing, and how do players, get into that loop, and how do they then do what the designer was intending to do, but also produce a kind of emergent behavior that we want to see. And so this is the so-called Aciu model, and I'm only focusing on the first two. The Aciu model is my own creation that I use to have students analyze games. And the cool thing is you can use it for digital games, you can use it for analog games. It's basically just trying to apprehend what is this game trying to do and how well is it doing it. The affordances are simply, what do I get to do in the game? And the constraints are, what am I limited from doing in the game? And the rest of this presentation is just dealing with these two aspects across a number of different LARPs. And again, when we're talking about affordances, like Donald Norman, who wrote about affordances in the way that we now conceive of it, is looking at things like doorknobs, where it means that, this is a natural surface that you as a human will, naturally, maybe sometimes culturally, but usually naturally, you'll go and grab it. And that then there will be a natural motion you will do to twist to go. Now, again, adult pretend play dates back thousands of years, but it's still imposing complex fictions on the real world, on brute reality, as it were. And that means you are going to be needing a lot of negotiation and a lot of handholds or doorknobs for you to use to maintain that social fiction. And without further ado, I'll just go through some examples and then conclude. One is Dagger Here, which is the premier buffer experience in the United States. Dagger Here, again, founded in the late 70s, and primarily consists of dressing up in medieval costumes and hitting each other with weapons. Now, the affordances, right? What do I get to do in the game? I get to hit people with these swords. That is fun. I get to pretend that I'm part of an idealized feudal order. That wasn't so fun for me. I was kind of a socialist in college, but I probably still am now. And I'm a little bit cagey about the weird, hierarchies that were imposed on us, but that was the most LARPy aspect. That was a fictional, kind of divine order that they were trying to maintain with various knights titles and others. And the other thing is I get to go camping with other LARPers. So I get to go off to a campground, and that is not insignificant. There's lots of us sitting around the fire and drinking as part of the Dagger Here activity. What am I limited to do? Of course, unlike with Dungeons and Dragons, which famously kind of put it out there that anything could be attempted, a player could try anything. You can't do anything in Dagger Here. You actually have a very limited array of options to take out your opponents, and that includes no headshots and a very strict hierarchy of hits. I also could not, when I was in there, introduce anything that was non-canonical in the world building, which meant there was always this tense relationship creatively about what I was allowed to say or not say as part of the LARP. And also my own combat prowess, if I'm able to hit someone well, is going to be connected with my character advancement. And this is a frequent trope across buffer LARPs, but not specifically. There's also other games that have these mechanisms. Then we have famous vampire, right? Mind's Eye Theater, The Masquerade. And this is an apology to Chloe that I don't have any Cthulhu or any horror games beyond vampire here, but that this is this is what I've got. What do I get to do in this vampire game? I get to pretend that I am powerful and sexy. I get to keep secrets from others, and they might make a game difference, and I get to dress up in this cool goth style, but I can't trust my fellow players or storytellers. And I have some work coming out on early vampire experiences in the 90s and how much sort of traumatic damage these designs did. I will need to join a clique in the game or it will not go well. And also rock, paper, scissors is a skill. It's the task resolution system. And if you can play rock, paper, scissors well, just like if you fight well in Dagger here, if you play rock, paper, scissors well, you will do better in the game. There's Metropolis, a game that I myself wrote in 2010 and then released in 2012 at Festival. And this is a game where you get to play out the plot of the silent film Metropolis. Here you get to be an overdramatic character from a silent film. And you also, when you're not in a scene, get to subtly alter the different scenes that you're in. But then at the same time, let me see if it won't let me go back. At the same time, you can kind of change the ending of Metropolis, which is why this game exists. However, this game is very narratively restricted. I can't, tell any story about Metropolis. I really have to follow the story of the film with certain caveats. And then I will also be utterly exhausted after this game. Most of my LARPs always exhaust the participants, and I apologize publicly for that. Then there's Just a Little Lovin', which is a game about New York City in the early 1980s when HIV/AIDS came to town. About 70 players, usually in a retreat environment, about 5 days long with workshops, then 3 days of play, then a day of debriefs and other workshops, is what Just a Little Lovin' is made of. And one of the cool things about it is you get to live out this hedonism and scene downfall in the early 80s, but you also just get a space of intimacy, and you're able to kind of act out your own queer desire and self in this space. If you're looking for actual hookups and actual drugs, that is not going to happen during the LARP. Oftentimes your relationships will pull you in a certain direction. It's not always a direction that you want to go, but then you have to then kind of decide, where is my character going from this crossroads? So it's very negotiated, and your plot line is very contingent on who's dying of a disease and who remains and how they react. So your play experience is very contingent on others. And of course, it takes 5 days to run. So it's a huge constraint for those of us who are running in the US as organizers. Blip is a game by Gintz Hotchkiss, and it's about dying in space, or mostly. There are 4 space pods that have been blown out of a destroyed space station, and you are trying to get back to each other, or at least save each other from everything. Now, spoiler, you do not have enough resources to save everybody. It's in the game that at least one character will die, and if you try to save everybody, the whole mission is probably endangered, and almost everybody will die if you try to save everyone. So you get to sit there in a chair with room with 3 other people, and send short messages and try and burn fuel economically so that you can catch up with each other. Very interesting resource management game, but again, around this kind of emotional playoff. So again, I get to play ship with adults, and I do actually get to experience these loneliness and longing emotions, but in a perceived safe space. Now, the constraints are, again, what am I limited from doing in this game? I just can't win the scenario, and those efforts will be actively frustrated. I have to sit in this chair for 2 hours, and I have to take the situation pretty seriously in order for it to work, because my this is the sleepover. Let's see if we got it. Nope, it didn't work. I don't know why my images collapsed suddenly, but with this, the sleepover is my final example from 2019 by Julia Ellingbo and Kat Jones. This is a game where you get to play teenagers, and they get to sit together and have this cozy, queer, kind of awkward space. And there are mechanics around making out, as well as sort of exploring the social space there without I think mocking teenagers or trivializing their ideas. And so it is a sort of safe space to explore queer sexuality through LARP. Of course, it is very difficult to do not in person, and so we tried these various adaptations, and it adapted okay to Second Life, but it's not a game that can function very well without the in-person LARP experience. And it also doesn't translate too well outside of the US. It relies on a shared teenage understanding of this sleepover culture. Now, what's the point of this, Dr. Tarner? Well, there are two main points I want to end with, which is that this offers us a genre agnostic views of LARPs as both games and experience design. We're looking at the limitations as well as the cool fantasy stuff that we get to do with any scenario, and really bracketing those into design problems we're trying to solve. We are making more doorknobs for the players to grab. We're also then part of a design dialogue, and I'm not just talking in LARP design, but game design, experience design, and broadly speaking, architecture, space, performance studies, etc. And we can take almost any situation and design an appropriate LARP for it, which I find very liberating. In any case, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry if I went a little long, so I appreciate any questions and comments later on. I'll have to check the chat because I was not able to see it.
Thanks so much, Evan. We'll make space for questions when Michael spoke, but I just wanted to thank you for that. And what I find really interesting in discussion of affordances and constraints, on the one hand, and some of this came up in the chat, as a LARP designer, you're like planning for those, right? You're like trying to fix those to some extent. And to another extent, it's an open system as well, where you're allowing for flexibility and fluidity. So that door handle that you're providing for the players may change shape in their hand, as part of the game itself. I also find really interesting, as in LARP, often the players often don't know what constraints and affordances they might be signing up for. And your discussion of like physically exhausting LARPs reminds me of an alien horror LARP that some of my friends went to in the UK. That was so physically grueling, 48 hours, like literally they couldn't sleep. The food they were given was inedible. Like one of them was like, I'm not actually a space marine. Like I can't actually hack it, like give this kind of physical punishment, but they hadn't signed up for that. And there was something kind of energizing about being thrown into that, but also like really quite traumatizing. So it's really interesting to hear you speak about that in design terms. So thank you for that, and we'll revisit some of those in a moment. Okay, so we'll move on to Michael now, who is going to speak next and follow up on Evan's paper with a bit more of a kind of close reading of a particular LARP, which will be interesting. So Michael is currently pursuing a thesis on, hang on a minute, I need to get my document back. Where's it gone? Hang on, sorry, Michael, I had all your info up. He's currently pursuing a thesis on the subject playing and learning through engagement in fiction. And this thesis focus is on analog games more broadly than LARP, including leisure board games, and he's looking at how fiction influences participation and learning. And the doctorate is co-sponsored by Sorbonne Paris University and also by the Asmodee Group. And Michael works for the Gaming Lab research program for Asmodee, which supports and disseminates research on board games. So Michael's doing fantastic work in bringing communities of analog game scholars together. So if you want to talk to Michael about that work and how to get involved in that transnational community, I really recommend getting in touch with him. So Michael's paper is titled History's Weight and Inertia in Legion, a Siberian Story. So I will hand over to Michael now, and I'll turn my camera off so you can just focus on him.
Thank you so much, Chloé, and thank you, Evan, for the previous panel. I will not talk about physically exhausting LARP, of course. This is a joke. So as Chloé said, I'm a PhD in PhD research, and my perspective is really different from the one of Evan's, so you'll need to adapt. So it's really empirical. It's a sociological approach of learning in an informal setting, which means in a non-educational setting. Of course, I'm also an artist designing playful things, among which there are Larps. So what I will be talking about today is the relationship. So informed by my perspective, the question I will delve in today is the relationship that players build with knowledge in an historical event, because it's a good example, and how it's affecting play, and how context, the general context of that game affects knowledge and play. So the interrelation of all these three things. I will not go back on what is a Larp, but what I mean when I say role-playing game, I mean the whole variety of practices that have a common point, some common points, among which the process of intercreativity that I will be focusing on. This is a contraction between interaction and creativity invented by Coralie David, which relies on resources and on shifting between social frames. And when I say resources, I will use that term a lot. This is all I mean by it. It's everything that is used to foster play and fiction. So play guides, books, but also word of mouth and finance and people. So history and role-playing. So I'm not an historian. I'm not a designer. I will not talk in that light. I will not question the veracity of Legion's version of history. Let's just say that history is the past as it happened, and history RPG are a genre, a special kind of genre drawing on history resources. So in history RPG, what research can say is that history is mostly used, really instrumentalized as a tool through the targeted picking of cultural material, and the aim is to serve play. Whereas, and I'm waiting for reactions, practices in like reenactment, roleplay does exist, but it aims mostly at serving history and culture. Since play in general relies on fiction, and even when historically the game is historically accurate or tries to be, there is no expectation for it to be true or real or a documentary. You know when you are in a game that it is not necessarily true. So the feeling of authenticity, historic authenticity, the perception of it is that it's sufficient to be authentic enough. You are searching for authenticity, not realism, like Hammer and Al said, but I will go back to that. How do I answer the questions I asked earlier? So first, an ethnographic fieldwork, including participant observation. So I've gone and played the Larp and observed, prepared heavily what I will observe, and then observed it. I was informed before going to the Larp with several tools, cognitive tools that help me observe, frame analysis, informal learning, and of course, a lot of EduLarp research. And of course, I'm not saying it here, but a lot of Larp design theory, fan theory, and so on. Adding to my observation, I also talked to a lot of players, and I led 3 long interviews. I will mainly use the one with 2 other players, Margot and Victor, that were French and that fit the general profile of the other players that were here. Quotes I will be using. are likewise samples that are significant for a number of players. So a last thing before starting the analysis, what is Legion for those who don't know about this LARP? So it's a Czech LARP that is in Czech Republic, organized by Rolling since 2014. It was first run in Czech for a Czech audience, Czech-speaking audience at least, because there are not only Czech that speaks Czech. Then translated and adapted for an international audience in English by Iva Vavrova in 2016. What is the LARP about? Well, it's about a moment in history on the general anecdote of the Czechoslovak Legion that had to go through Siberia to go back to Czech Republic through the port of Vladivostok at the end of the First World War. This is a subject that is still controversial today for ethnic and cultural reasons. For instance, statues on memorials are a question for Hungarian ethnic groups and Slovak ethnic groups. And in Russia, it's something completely different. The LARP takes place on a 20 kilometers march, so it's not physically exhausting as a LARP by Evan Tarner, but it might be a little bit. The players join the LARP through the social media picture sharing. This is why you will see quite a lot of pictures, beautiful pictures that avoid showing the modern infrastructure that are all around here, of course. And the scales of the historical resource that are around this LARP are both macro, big events, and micro history, individual or small events related. So now let's go on three kind of relationships that player form to historicity. First off, the relation to historical information. So Moshoki wrote in heritage studies a theory crafting way. Moshoki theorized that ludic involvement may distract from heritage or history authenticity. While I nuance the opposition between the two, since play opportunities that have history can be comprised in ludic involvement, I concur, my research concurs with his conclusion, since the priority of self-directed learning in Legion was on characters, so heavily romanticized fiction, rather than the more accurate one. It's still used as a resource, but it's not prioritized. Second, there is a kind of a dual relationships to documents. They are at the same time perceived as an accurate account of history for the reasons I will evoke just right now, cultural reasons afterwards. But also they are kept in the context. So at the same time, factual and fictional. Fictional because they are still a tool, instrumentalization of real information to do intercreative improvisation and create play opportunities. And so lastly, on something I will go back on quite a few times, in the overall intercultural frame of international LARPing, there was a strong coherence between the territory where we were and the subject of the LARP, and the supposed ethnic group of the organization. So we were in Czech Republic with a LARP created by supposedly Czech people, and they were the organization, which is a vague concept conjured by players to include creators of the LARP, creators of the resources, and present volunteers. Of course, organization doesn't mean anything. It's what players use to talk about that. So this puts for foreigners the organization in the social role of those who know in the frame of interaction. They are the ones that are normative because they are in their country on their subjects, and this reinforced authority that is already there in an organization during any LARP, and much more in pre-planned structures like Czech LARPs, content LARP do. So in the quote, you can see that Margot and Victor really sensed that the documents were accurate, historically accurate, and sourced, and at the same time they sensed that they were authored. They knew that it was a version of history and not a scientific depiction of it, of course. Second point on 3 points on relationship to history is something that is quite known on other researches, so I will go quickly. Player resources, what I mean by that is the knowledge shared during the LARP, which is sometimes factually incorrect, but at the same time, documents can be factually incorrect too. Like I just said, I'm not going to do that because I'm not an historian. Platforms and group practices. So as the players were multicultural, but the intercultural aspect of the LARP is somehow influenced by similar practice, like Evan said, no, Chloé said, there is kind of a blurring of practices, and for people who do the work of going to another country to LARP, there are some common points most of the time. There was use of the platforms, social media, that are quite common, so stories, memes, and so on. And sometimes they even reactivate the platform after the kind of community, if we can call it that, have been disbanded. For instance, in reaction to actuality about war. There is the fragmented debriefing. By that, I don't mean the workshop of a debriefing, but really times where people will try to reconstruct memory of the event collectively, expand on one's global understanding of the LARP, and reinforce social connection, even sometimes during the LARP. So this brings knowledge, existing knowledge to collide with the situation. For instance, in the quote, you can see Margot connecting the situation to a memory she has of her being a child and being explained why Czechoslovakia was not a country anymore. And she makes a connection that is very interesting, that is asking why it was a country before, which is kind of the theme of the LARP. Of course, fun theorizing, it was a little bit introduced by Chloé, and we will talk about that later, I think, in the conversation, and sensitivity to and sensibilization to subjects, like it was seen in EduLARP's informal situation as well. And that is something that I would like to do more research on, because we really need longer view of that on the long run. Some memes that are relevant because they are linked to history. And I will go on one of my main points before concluding. So meta-reflexive loops, what I mean by that is a kind of conscious shifting between modes of engagement inside a primary frame. So playing is always the same activity, but inside it, we can take several voices. We can transform our experience by keying, by changing modes of engagements. So I call that meta-reflexive loops because they can happen in a loop, which is something I'm drawing upon theory in 2020 Knut book that was released. And I would like to go further than the idea of the loop being, is this historically correct, or what do I want my character to do? But looking at the frame of the interaction, the frames that give sense to what is happening, participation in play rely mostly on maintaining the frame of play. So reacting to some things that may disrupt the frame, irrelevance or transgression. So for instance, when Margot playing Siberian peasant starts singing in Spanish during the march, this is not a random example, it happened. If we see the frame as simply diegetic or non-diegetic, in on off game, in or off character, and we separate character and player, this transgression might be enough to unbalance the frame and call for active reparative action, so criticism or someone reframing what she's just done. But if we see play as one primary frame that includes multiple modes of engagement, then the player reactions to maintain the frame is more understandable, because they reacted by smiling at the nice gesture of singing during the march, because they appreciated the togetherness that it was to maintain a social frame, a togetherness frame, rather than a diegetic one. So it did not interrupt play. It was just something on top of it that is integrative to play. It is part of play. So Margot still had a reparative meta-reflexive loop. She repaired the frame retroactively. So after having sung in Spanish, she asked, merde, did my character know that? So merde is in French in the real text. I kept it in French because I think most people know what that means. So another example of meta-reflexive loop is recalling the symbolic historic authenticity, such as, oh, I'm walking 20 kilometers, but legionnaires, they have walked through the entire Siberia. Oh, it's 0 degrees Celsius outside, but it was in Siberia. Or this object I'm holding in my hands, this is a game object called the journal of my character. But at the same time, what we know about the legionnaires comes from journals they kept. So there is a link to the legionnaires through the journal. And as I said, there is the interculturality of the situation. So being in a foreign country, participating in a culturally significant activity led by people perceived as locals, like we saw in the quote, they are proud. We sense that they are here. And during the whole event of Legion, and not only during play, it meant maintaining the social frames of being a foreigner. For instance, to avoid involuntarily insulting the culture, like defending the ideal of communism in a post-USSR country, which would be quite insensitive. This is quite a weight of history, or more precisely, a weight of the social frames relating to intercultural situation. And it's linking closely the fictional on the very real cultural identity of people that are involved locally. For instance, playing Legion in France would be a very different experience, which you can think about other Larps like Alat Izar without Palestinians and so on, which has been an argument, I think, by an article, maybe by Evan. I'm concluding in quite a bit, just saying that emotion is a huge part of this meta-reflexive loop, in the fact that history makes it something perceived as real. So the fiction is not historical fiction is not required to be real, but at the same time, it's perceived sometimes to be. Some takeaways. So as I said, there is a dual relationships to historical knowledge, at the same time fictional and factual. So there is quite an authority on the organization and a responsibility design-wise. The meta-reflexive loop, I hope you understood what I meant by that. So switching between modes of engagement while maintaining the frame, which is also something that that is called dual consciousness, or using the immersion metaphor. So my main conclusion about that is that seeing that as not necessarily in the immersion metaphor that is in and out. This is just a personal view, but the immersion is in and out, or player or character, either one of them, dual consciousness. I think this idea can make us forget the complexity of being a player that is portraying a character, and in an intercultural setting or international LARP, we can see the complexity of that when we see the overall thing as the experience of the player, and we focus on what the players say about their experience, what they feel, and how they react when we can observe that in the field. This research also provides, of course, much more data to research that has been done before. So, for instance, Moshoki, who worked on historical authenticity affordances, or historical authenticity doorknobs, maybe, as Evan would say, and to more informal situations of learning, since a lot of situations of learning in LARP are studied in formal settings, educational settings that are more or less free of curriculum. This brings to the idea that more research will be needed on that kind of play experience, and that can be decorrelated from history. For instance, I'm thinking that we can compare this kind of involvement to touristic experiences, such as participating into folkloric dancing, while trying not to insult local people, or visit an heritage site of a foreign country without speaking the language. And I think it shows that what anthropology and sociology can bring to LARP, and what LARP can bring to sociology, like it was pointed out by Kat Jones, for instance. But we can also go away from really history and culture, and we can tackle sometimes the idea of identity. For instance, I participated in the LARP The Future is Straight, which tackles very sensitive LGBTQIA+ themes, and that drew a majority of LGBT+ players. The experience would have been much different if it was with a majority of presumed cisgender heterosexual individual, as many LARPs are, unfortunately. I would like to further this research one day, and I hope you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Really fascinating, and fascinating to see you working on some of those new concepts that Evan says, you know, we've been developing in LARP research over the last few years, and you kind of bring in your own your own take to some of those. That meta-reflexive loop's a really fascinating way of thinking about the kind of paradoxical frame shifting and maintaining of frames that occurs simultaneously in LARP. And I think the point that, you know, making about authenticity and immersion, and this is something myself and my colleague Laura have written about, being dependent on shifting in and out of character and shifting in and out of frames and applying different knowledge contextually as the LARP continues. And it's not really about being in, staying in character in that like really simplistic sense of the word. So it's just fascinating stuff, and it's a really good deep dive into that particular LARP as well, and the kind of historical context to which it's dealing with, and the kind of cultural sensitivities there as well. So thank you so much for both of those papers. I want to open the discussion by kind of asking you some sort of broad questions about your status and researchers on LARP, and then open to the audience to see if there's any specific questions about the papers themselves. So I'm going to open with a question that's really kind of what you think the value is in terms of, you know, the value to game studies, the value to kind of the relationship of games, and particularly here at Met, we're really interested in games and social issues, and the kind of the value of games in commenting on, you know, very urgent kind of problems that society is facing. For you, and for me, LARP's really interesting in that from that point of view. For you though, what is the value of both writing, playing and studying LARP? Like, what are you getting from it? What do you think its value is? Why do you think we should be interested in it? I think, you know, it's be good to kind of interrogate that a little bit.
Well, thanks for the question. I think the mixture between sort of play, design, you know, running, and also teaching LARP, you know, has to do with its status is a very marginal form, but a very powerful one. You know, I mean, when I have I'm consulting on a project and someone asks if they want to call something a LARP, I say, well, do you want to attract LARPers? That's a very specific group of people, and you know, someone who is looking to do that. And if you're looking for a wider audience that's not LARPers, then you have to rename or recalibrate that, or somehow, you know, make this non-insular. And so what I see it as is very grassroots folk art that fuels so many other, even more commercial forms. We can think of escape rooms as one prominent example. But once you actually are in that design space, it's very difficult to distinguish you know, what I even see as reflexive design practices, where you design something and you see, oh, does that work? No, that didn't work. Well, let's try this. No, oh, okay, this does this thing, or this produced this kind of play. It's the same questions that you do as a researcher. It's the exact same thing. So it is academic work to design and implement LARPs, and it should be done with more rigor than probably what I do. But I'm at least trying to think through the categories that we use, so that we're not restrictive on genre and sort of national origin, because I think we're in a much broader artistic dialogue, and we need those terms and we need that research to stand on.
Thank you, Evan. That idea of game design as research is something that I'm really interested in. I know loads of people are too, but that the processes of game design, particularly collaborative and collective game design, is precisely the process of research, and where the outcome, the game, is the research. And I kind of blurring that the game isn't just, we did some research and we made a game. The game is the research. And I think that's, you know, that's a really rich idea. So thank you for that. Michael, what about you?
Yeah, I think I've quoted the article of Evan that talks about fan theory. And there is a blurring of lines in especially in LARP between researchers and well, I said researchers, so I will rephrase that, between academic researchers, so people that are employed or linked to a university, independent researchers that try to stay linked to university, researchers that do not try anymore to be linked to university, in which category, the third category, I would put all the people that do fan theory. They do a kind of research, which is sometimes methodically interesting. Sometimes it is essays. So it's methodically something that I, for one, would not be able to use as an argument in my research. But at the same time, I think these essays that they give us ideas, and since research is a lot of creativity, which is another bridge that we can make between research and design. Research is about creativity, and the essays, they give us ideas, even when they are silly. They give us ideas. For instance, I've written an essay that is really silly about the Jean-Michel douchebag technique, being a douchebag to succeed in life in Larp. This is really silly, but maybe someone will get inspired and do a research about something next to that. And this discussion is really something that we should have about what kinds of theory can we use and how. Because I have the problem, one last thing is that I have the problem in my university where I used Larp research, and they told me, this is gray literature. This is gray. This is not exactly, this is not academic, but this is not exactly scientific. And I defended it, but I think we really need to work on what is the epistemological status of the different theory fields that exist.
Thanks. That's really important, isn't it? There's a Sarah Lynn has just posted your essay on the douchebag technique there in the chat, so that people can check that out if you're interested in Michael's essay. Yeah, that's the importance of drawing on community knowledge, but also like acknowledging that and trying to break down the hierarchies of knowledge that are kind of at play between academia and praxis and community. I've been doing work on co-production recently and kind of different ways of thinking about co-production as a research tool, and that's a really nice way of thinking about what's already happening in Larp. We think that Larp as a mode, as a game mode, and as a community of practice is already about trying to include experiential knowledge, marginalized forms of knowledge, and break down those hierarchies. Although, as you said in your paper, Michael, they sometimes still like concretize, and they're like, oh, we'll see the organizers as people who hold the historical knowledge that we as players are going to learn from them, and that those hierarchies still kind of are at work. So thank you for those. I have one more kind of broad question, and then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll come to. And my broad question is a really tough one, I think, and it's something I'm still trying to think through. But what do you see as the distinction or the difference between Larp, as broadly conceived as we've been conceiving it today, and other modes of like analog gameplay, particularly like tabletop role-playing games, which obviously is very related, and Michael, you work on board games. And I think all of those modes have to some extent open system fluidity that open to hacking. They're imbricated in communities of practice and subcultures and stuff. But what is it that's different about Larp, or that's special about Larp? If you had to kind of be pressed on that point. And I don't have a good answer myself, so it's a bit of a mean question.
This is where we get Marcus Montela's kind of adaptation of the first person audience concept, where you are LARPing for yourself. You're not performing for others. There was a Twitter hot take the other day of oh, when I stream I'm LARPing, and I thought like sure, if especially if you're performing for yourself, like I'm not going to dispute that, but really you are in the end the audience and no one else. And even with tabletop role playing, where it's very collaborative, and again, someone doesn't step away from the table and continue to tabletop role play, but in LARP you can. You can say, I'm going to go off and LARP in my car, and you're still part of the story universe, even though you have left the table.
I'm LARPing when I'm asleep in my 24/7 LARP, horror LARP or whatever. I'm LARPing while I'm asleep at night at the LARP. Yeah, completely.
I'll just say one more thing, which is the sort of journalistic adaptation of the idea of LARP, which is now like pervasive, especially since the Trump era in 2016, and this idea of right-wing people are LARPing people, but also Anne Helen Peterson saying that we LARP our jobs, right? That we are just sort of like all burnt out, dependent on these jobs, but we still drag ourselves out of bed and put on this performance, and that that sense of LARP as being this really strange boundary between fiction and reality, where you yourself are the audience, I think is productive. But that we shouldn't then be demonized for exploring that. Rather, it should be valorized as just another form of fiction creation.
That's a great answer, Evan. Thank you. Michael, what are your thoughts about the kind of specificities of LARP, I suppose, as a mode of play?
I will tell you exactly that in 3 years' time, when I finish my PhD about the subject. Please be patient.
We'll wait for you. We'll wait for the answer, Michael, with beta care.
But yeah, I agree. First person point of view or audience is something that is very relevant to LARP, and I will be asking if we can see that in a board game, for instance, in hidden role board games, when you have a hidden role in games like Werewolf, for instance. Do you play for a first-person audience is a question. At the same time, I really like Coralie David's concept. She's in literary studies, comparative literary studies, and she coined the idea of intercreativity, interaction and creativity put together, to foster the idea that it is kind of the engaging formula of LARP, of a role-playing game in general. And I think it may be it may be the specificity of role-playing games, I think, to be at the same time a game, so something that makes people play, well, an activity of play, which is what I call the game right now, an activity of play, and at the same time being intercreative, so creating fiction collaboratively. And one last point on that, when I say collaboratively, I do intend collaboratively even for solo role-playing, which is kind of a fringe example that we should be talking about all the time. I think it's collaborative at the same way as a toy. A toy is collaborative with the designer that made it, because the designer shared something, and then you have the toy. So I think it's kind of answering one of Sarah's questions for Evan about affordances. For me, affordances is kind of an author's sharing something, and like a toy, people are receiving it and interacting with it, so it stays collaborative even in solo mode.
That's such an important point, isn't it? And you collaborating not just, I guess, with the author, but from those of us who are interested in kind of the other elements at work, the other elements in the network, you're collaborating with the materials, the tools, the props, that all sorts of collaborations are going on. So that's a really cool answer. Thank you. Let's go to Sarah's question, actually, that's in the chat, which was for Evan, but Michael's also kind of offered a bit of an answer there too. So Sarah says, Evan, in your discussion of affordances and constraints, I noticed you're using I statements. Would you agree that different players also interpret different affordances and constraints, potentially leading to this issue of not being able to predict actual player behavior?
Yes, that is one of the issues in LARP design. If it's co-creative, then you have to orient people around a shared vision. And I made the I statements on purpose because you are you're always at this decision: should I play this LARP or not? And to play the LARP means you're joining a certain type of collective, a co-creative, creative collective, but you don't know if you should trust anybody and it's very vulnerable. You're embodied, you're in the space. I again reading accounts from the 1990s and even more very recent examples. I mean, LARPs have a default of marginalizing and traumatizing people, a default for it. So we can valorize the form as much as we want, but the default LARP will hurt somebody, which I think is very important. And so oftentimes then the players will come in with various expectations, and your job as a designer and as an organizer is to try to narrow them to a field where you can you can predict the player behavior, but it's not going to happen in certain designs, and that you might constrain the player behavior so much that you've also snuffed out the light of intercreativity. So what do? You sort of have to rely on the your own instincts in cultivating emergent play, and then also have your safety and support techniques, right? In case it crosses a line. And then otherwise, and I discussed this in my LARP emergence narrative article from several years ago, where basically you are always, as a game master or organizer, evaluating your own vision and the safety of what's going on, right? Is this in alignment with what I had intended, and is this going to hurt anybody? And the visibility of those things, as Sarah's suggesting, is very difficult to apprehend. It's why I recommend people play as many games as possible out the gate, because that experience becomes your instinct, and then you can begin to build better games off of those instincts, in theory, or hopefully.
Yeah, it's about kind of building that habit or habitus of practice and communication as well, isn't it? There's around, I think it's such an important point as well, that often, because we enjoy LARP, we think it's really interesting, really useful, really fun, potentially quite liberating. And there has been some excellent examples of how to run really good LARPs, but actually mainstream experience of LARP is often, like particularly the big fest LARPs that I've gone to, horror LARPs that I've been to, where often abusive play behavior is licensed by some of the attitudes and the idea that well, we're in character, so it's like fine for me to try and dominate you or whatever. Like, I think that's that's a really important point, Evan, and can't be overstated. So thank you for that. We've got another question in the chat that I'm gonna skip to before we wrap up, because it's a really interesting one and it can involve both the speakers, I think. So Sean says, I'm thinking about the stakes of meta-reflexive loops in LARP, riffing off Evan's point about the dramaturgies of LARP echoing, but also perhaps reframing or intervening in various realities of our lives. Sean says they're curious to think about post-LARP experiences beyond the immediate debrief that takes place. Have there been interesting instances or propositions of sustaining conversations beyond the kind of immediate debrief and of the things that are incubated during the LARPs? Perhaps there's something here about bleed to a kind of social, political world out from the LARP outwards. So that's a really interesting question. Yeah, like sustaining that debrief or sustaining that dialogue beyond the LARP itself. What are the potentials there? Really cool question. Thank you for that, Sean.
Maybe you have more examples than me. That's
I'll just say, Just a Little Lovin' you have a debrief buddy, and this actually is in addition to all of the structured debrief material, which includes again a historical perspective, actual people who suffer from HIV, AIDS, and other debriefing activities. Again, a full day followed by a dance party. But after even the dance party, you are assigned your check-in partner, whom you're supposed to keep checking in with months later, and that is a sign. And you don't think, oh, you kind of think, oh, I've just been to this LARP, and who cares? I'll be fine. It's really nice to have somebody who has artificially, again through the design, been imposed upon you as your check-in person, and just to even have a few direct messages saying, here are my thoughts 3 or 6 months later after the LARP. But again, it has to be sort of included in the design, or the default is, you wind up, you go to your own friend click, and then you post crap about it on social media.
Thank you for that. Michaël, do you want to add anything?
Nothing to add. Just on my fieldwork, what I could see is that, and I mentioned it, there are some traditions, some cultural traditions that are kept in by some LARPers that have experience, that will take the role of animation in, for instance, Facebook groups, or in the groups that are formed after the LARP. And thanks to these people, sometimes there will be informal debriefing that will be created. And this is the same kind of people that will go talk to you in private to make sure you are all right, and do that kind of things. So there is also an individual informal way, emergent kind of a way to do that. But,
thank you. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There's a kind of an informal community of keeping those conversations going. That's been my experience too, although mostly in Horror Lab, like, can degenerate into just posting shit about it online, as I said. Thank you so much for those answers and for the rich discussion following the papers. I'm going to just thank our speakers, and I'm going to stop the recording and wind up. So thank you to Michaël for their paper on the Siberian Legion LARP, and to Evan for his insights on LARP design and LARP designers research. Two fascinating papers from totally different disciplinary perspectives that I think really speak to each other and give us lots to think about. And thank you for the comments in the chat and all the sharing that's happened of resources and research. That's been really brilliant. If you've not checked out the chat, have a look. There's loads of cool links in there. And thank you for the questions. So I'm gonna stop the recording now. But just before I do, I just want to quick plug. Man Game Centre are running a symposium in June, end of June, that's being co-sponsored by Gaming Lab, and Michael's doing some work for us on that too. And it's got 2 days. One is on digital game studies, the other is on analog game studies. We have a speaker from the Nordic LARP community coming to talk on the second day. So if you've got any ideas about corporeality, embodiment in gameplay, and you're interested in coming along, or you want to pose a paper or a panel, please check out that link that's in the chat, and we'd be really happy to see you at multi-platform. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now. It's been a blast.